right now I'm a first year medical student, and earlier today we were discussing this new concept to me, which is called trauma-informed care. And when I'm speaking of traumas, I'm referring to experiences that people have gone through that have made you feel like there's a real or perceived threat to your life or the life of someone else. And an example of a trauma that people see often in clinics, from what the doctors were talking about to us today, had to do with women who were victims of sexual assault. And you know, the stories that they were telling us had to do with women who grew up with abusive parents, or an abusive coach, or when they were 14 they had a traumatic experience happen to them in a doctor's office, and because of that they lived the rest of their lives in fear of reliving, or those experiences happening again. And those traumas lead to PTSD. And PTSD is this thing that your body will basically not forget what you've gone through, and it will force you to keep reliving this thing. Your body will act like it did as you were being assaulted, for instance. And it's extremely hard to emphasize how delicate these situations are for patients. And speaking as a medical student myself, looking at this from the other side of the table is challenging, because so much of medical school up to this point has been training us to be effective, and it's all about efficiency and making sure you're able to get this standardized patient encounter done in under 18 minutes, and then 16 minutes, and then 14 minutes, and being able to type up your reports fast. And when we come across a patient who has genuine trauma, someone who's really terrified to have somebody come up from them and palpate their back, for instance, because of a previous assault, it's really challenging. And I'm very glad that we are being educated on how do you approach these types of situations as a doctor. And for me, as we were talking about like what trauma is, what PTSD is, it really kind of brought up some memories that I've had from my own experiences that I can share. And I think trauma comes in many shapes and sizes, and for me it came in the form of two police officers that showed up at 9 a.m. and knocked on the door. And I can go through this experience a little bit, but basically, I was at home with my mom and my brother, and these two cops said, we need to speak to your mom. And, my dad didn't come home that night, and I assumed my dad had like done something stupid and he was in jail for something. And when I went and got my mom and I said, "Mom, there's these police officers at the door," and she walked out to go see them, she just broke down in tears because she knew what they were going to tell us. And for me, I still didn't really believe anything, or I had no idea what was going on. And I woke up my brother. I told my brother that there's these cops here, it has to do with our dad. And what the police officers had to tell us was that they found my dad's cold, dead body on a bike path, and some joggers earlier that morning had found it, called the cops, and they knew it was him because he had his wallet on him and his ID was in his wallet. So they had a positive ID. And the cops said, "Here's this pamphlet for some resources on grieving if you need it." And then they left. And to this day, that was December 22nd, 2018. To this day, I still can't really believe anything that happened. And it's really tough for me to process any of it, because growing up, my dad was the biggest, strongest, smartest guy I knew. And to think that he just somehow magically, or just suddenly just disappeared like this, is still unbelievable. And it's grieving that for me is something that I'm never going to just be able to walk away from. Every day I wake up, I think about him, and I miss him so much, and I wish he was here. And I've told this story so many times that I'm not crying. Like, that's just, I'm a pretty open person, in case you haven't realized. I love my dad a lot. I miss him a lot. I think about him all the time. It really sucks that he isn't here. And specifically why I bring this up while we're on the subject of trauma is because I feel like I experienced PTSD because after my dad died, my brain really thought that, that this thing of your dad dying so suddenly, so unexpectedly, is so rare. It seemed impossible. So statistically unlikely that it seems impossible. And it really changed how I approached life and how I looked at life. And I just started looking at situations differently. I would assume that whatever bad thing that could possibly happen would happen, so I needed to be ready for it. And I don't know if you would call that paranoia. I would call it extreme anxiety, because, I love riding my bike, and I still ride my bike every day. And my dad died riding his bike. And I don't know if this is the part of PTSD that involves you putting yourself back in these situations intentionally, but, I'm in situations on my bike where I'm looking at things happen in front of me, where if I see someone driving way too fast or swerving or, whatever, I feel like this is going to be it, and I'm going to die, and it's going to be fast, and I want it to be fast, and I want it to be painless. And that's not to say I want to die, but I basically live in a constant state of fear. And the amount of fear that I have has ratcheted up so much after my dad died, because my brain just is rewired to kind of accept death as this thing that can happen. And you're just always on the lookout for what it's going to be. And I don't want to die. I look forward to seeing where life goes. I don't have a clear vision of where that is, but life is scary and it's fragile. And, I'm trying to keep this focused on the trauma here, because I feel like I've gone through emotional trauma through losing my dad and through having to just kind of grieve, especially those first 2 years after he died. And I still feel this, but not as much to the same degree. But it's incredibly scary to go through life sometimes for me, to just know that, like, this is it. This is going to be it. Like, my brain will just assume that this is the last time I'm going to ever walk outside. This is the last time I'm ever going to see a sunset. This is the last time I'm ever going to ride my bike, or tell my mom I love her, or tell my brother that I love him, and tell them how proud I am of them. And so basically it kind of makes me live every day like it's my last day. I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. I will say also, in addition to that, the amount of anger that I have from missing my dad is what motivates me to do a lot of things. Medical school is one of them. My dad was really clear he wanted me to go to med school. And so it might be hollow for me to say this, but, I'm really doing this for him. I don't see myself being in med school if it wasn't for him. It's a lot of pain and suffering to get through med school and to even start it or to get into it. And a lot of that came from him. But without talking too much about myself and trying to focus more on trauma, to me, just hearing people talk about the traumas that they've experienced today, and talking about how important it is for healthcare professionals to be informed of the traumas of their patients when you're approaching one of them, to me, it makes a lot of sense. And it's something that I think people should talk more about. And I'm glad that it's something that we're finally taking into account. And to kind of, just for the sake of completeness for this video, like, what did we talk about today in terms of how do you approach a woman who was sexually assaulted when she was 13 years old? Is your job as a healthcare professional in that situation is to make sure that your patients know that they are in 100% control of everything that happens. You're not going to do anything without their explicit permission. You're not even going to walk towards your equipment until you tell them what you're going to do and ask them if they're okay with it. And you create an environment where they feel safe and welcomed and able to express themselves. And to be a healthcare professional in those situations is extremely challenging work to do, and to empathize with your patients. And another thing that they talked about that I would like to share with you guys is this thing called comparative suffering. And I don't know why, but I think our brains just kind of naturally do this. When, if I hear someone telling me how bad their story is or how bad their day is, part of my brain also says, yeah, well, I've also gone through some really bad days too. I'm comparing myself or my suffering to theirs. And, or sometimes people look at that the other way. It's like, if you're having a bad day at work, just think, there's people around the world right now who don't even have a home because they're seeking asylum because their home is a war zone and it's blown up and people all around them are dying. And so, how does your day compare to that? And the thing that they've told us about comparative suffering is that it's a very bad habit and you shouldn't do it. And that isn't to say that you shouldn't empathize with people, but that is to say that, you shouldn't beat yourself up, or you shouldn't, try to put yourself on some kind of pedestal for being like, I've been through worse than this person has. And so that's really what they're trying to get at. And so in that regard, I think it is something that is worth incorporating into our characters, is to make sure that we're able to empathize with people, but we're not also going to just be trying to say, yeah, well, I have one better than you on that. So that's really important. But just really getting back to trauma-informed care and how do you practice it, and not even if you're a healthcare professional, if you're just someone who cares about someone who's gone through trauma, like, how do you approach these situations? And it really comes down to making sure that the person who's gone through the trauma that you're caring for feels safe and they feel like they're in control of this situation. And you do not need to rush anything with people. You do not push people into situations that they don't want to be in. I think, I've spoken to grief counselors, and, one of the things they say about bike riding for me is they're like, it kind of almost seems like it's this thing that is some kind of exposure therapy for you, because, that's something that's scary and it could end really badly. And so you just keep doing it and you keep exposing yourself to this stimulus that is clearly eliciting a very strong negative response. And that's how you overcome your fears, right? Is through this exposure therapy. And I think, I can understand the logic behind that line of reasoning, but I also feel like people who've experienced traumas, when you give them the space and the feeling of safety and comfort and warmth of just, you're another human being trying to hear another human being's story, and you care about that person, and you want to see them do well, and you want to help them along their way in life. I think when you just add the right ingredients to that situation, you don't need to push people to do these things. They'll do it on their own. I genuinely believe this. And so I'm going to wrap things up with that. I hope that this video is helpful, and if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out. I'm still learning quite a bit about trauma-informed care, but I'm very interested in it, and I think it's something that is definitely worth practicing, not just for me, but hopefully for all of us, to just get better at treating people the way that they should be treated in situations where they've had very bad experiences in the past. And thank you again for all watching, and I hope everyone is doing well. I'll talk to you guys next time.